What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Novichenko Whips EJ257 build video number 3. So I've pretty much sourced all the needed parts to put together our 257 short block and then of course long block after we prepare the heads. So the one thing that I've been contemplating getting is a new rod for this one that had a spun bearing. They sell OEM rods on eBay. They have different casting numbers. I was kind of worried, like, what if it weighs slightly different and you might get a disbalanced engine, you might get a vibration. And then I also saw people selling rods for cheap that were also looked like this, like they had a spun bearing. And so my dad said, put in a new bearing, put it on the new crankshaft and measure the play. First, of course, you can go the old, put it on there and see if there's any play or movement. But then we'll actually use some micrometers and bore gauge type tools to see like what our clearances are. I think you want, something pretty tight, 1,000th or so. My dad said anything over 2,000ths, you start feeling the play, and that's not great. So let's put in a new bearing. I really like these King race bearings. I've put them into other builds before and they work really well. So I'm going to put that in here and I'll show you what it looks like. Of course, the bearing wise, you can only put it in one way because of these special teeth. What's up, everybody? We got a package from Subaru and it's our Type RA pistons. I thought this is going to come with just pistons alone, but I can see we've got our pins, wrist pins, and everything we need to assemble this. Don't know what they mean by BV, but the size Bs are what we need. Let's go ahead and, so yeah, it comes with rings and everything already installed. That's pretty awesome. So I'm pretty sure these are all Subaru standard spec. Let's compare what this piston looks like compared to a regular STI piston. So for example, of course, this one looks super ugly. So there's some kind of casting numbers, 003R on the side of that one, 007V, 007V. I don't think the casting is too different, and I've seen videos about this. Actually, look at this. This one looks thicker than that one. And I don't know if that makes the Type RA pistons lighter. I'm sure I could weigh them. And I also don't know if the material on the side skirts is different. It looks pretty similar to me. But anyway, these, if we just try super easy, and yeah, they feel pretty snug. There you go. There's how that looks. Of course, these pistons are a little warmer than the block, so you want when you're assembling an engine, you want all your components and metals and whatever to be the same temp. That's why you have to leave them in the same room, in the same place, to make sure that everything is the same temperature. But I'm happy that it comes with everything, rings and everything assembled. That's good. I'm going to check all the other ones, make sure they're a size B as well, because if you recall, all of my original pistons were the B size, which is the slightly smaller spec from factory, compared to size A, which is the slightly bigger. We've got another package in the mail. It is our EJ257 head gaskets. Here's the part number if you need it. Definitely buy OEM if you're doing a more or less OEM build. I have actually a pair of head gaskets here, but I believe these are from a 2-liter, and I don't remember if it's a JDM engine, but let me show you the difference. For example, if I overlay this one, I think you're gonna see some differences. So, for example, mostly everything lines up. It might be the exact same, actually. I mean, I'm gonna measure these I don't remember where I got these from. I've had these for a couple years just laying around, and they're not OEM. That's probably why I never used them. The number on the side is different, 44AA482. And I'm trying to kind of guess. But from the very, yeah, it looks like a 2-liter gasket. So look at that. You see the gap there is much greater. So this is meant for a 2-liter heads or 2-liter engine. And then this head gasket, of course, for the 2.5. So we'll store these in the same place. Definitely be careful to not let these bend or fold, because you want to keep them as nice and symmetrically flat as possible. Another day after some deliveries, we've taken delivery of our King Racing high performance bearings. So these are going to be the bearings we use for the mains. So you can also see that the rear bearing on the Subarus, the one back there, uses this interesting thrust design where it seats in there. I think it's probably the one that holds the crankshaft in place. And then there's the King Racing rod bearings, and you can see these are considerably smaller. Yeah, I guess you could say considerably smaller in diameter in a way. They're similar to the mains. I can see there's some of the mains have these holes going through them for oiling. The mains don't have those holes. They get oiled from the crankshaft itself. Here's our brand new Subaru nitride treated crankshaft. Comes all nice and oiled. And so by the looks of it, everything is super smooth. What I want to do, as you may know, in the last video, we took the used crank and we put it on a machine and we measured the, I guess, the bendiness of it, and it was bent. When my dad placed like a micrometer on here, we were getting 25 thousandths of play in the middle. I would be interested to see how much play this one has brand new. And I wonder if any of these recently have been released bent, because I saw some forums where people were warning other people to check their crankshafts before using them in engines for those tolerances. And so I had my own STI a few years ago, and I used to always be like pro ARP, but ARP is quite expensive for their stud kit. And then I used something off of Amazon, this Exotic Performance. They had pretty cool test results and data posed on their listing, and so I've used these head studs before. I don't know if they're half price of what like ARPs are, but honestly, they worked great. They're very nicely packaged. Again, if you're building like a 1,000 horsepower Subaru, you're definitely not going to use this kit. You probably won't even use an OEM ARP replacement kit. You're probably going to go with the larger stud kit that they sell, and you have to reinforce that. But from my experience so far, these have worked great. Super good threads, easy install. I once bought like I was doing an engine build and I didn't want to buy brand new ARPs because I was just reusing another old block. And I bought like used ARPs, and it was a bit of a pain because some of the threads were wonky. Some of the Allen key holes at the tops were, messed up. So I would not recommend a used kit, not because they could be not strong enough per se, but in my eyes, there's just so much probably force and work to get them out that you could strip some of those hex holes and you won't have a great time reusing them. So yeah, the next steps will be to put together the bearings inside that second rod that had a spun bearing, and I'm just going to work out and see what the tolerance is on the crank and see if we can reuse our rods at least number 2, that had a spun bearing. We'll probably compare it to number 4 or 1 or 3 and see what the differences are once you install this in there. Use a micrometer and see if the rods are still usable. Here's the new crankshaft from Subaru. So 0 play whatsoever on the edges, and then we're gonna put it in the middle and measure the middle. So here in the middle we have about half of a hair thickness in variance. So that's a straight crank compared to the old one down there where we had 25 thousandths of play. Should be straight to go in. Let's set out the 0 and spin it.
Maybe half a thousand, maybe 1,000, but it's okay.
It's good. We have to take out this pin from the old crank to put it in the new one. There's a trick to getting it out. Interesting, the new one doesn't come with it.
Oh.
Now you have to tap it in or
Tap it in.
clamp it with something strong.
No, just the stanky.
Make sure it seats evenly. Oh, now it's too far on the front. More or less even. Let's set you guys over here. I don't think I need to put on crazy torque on the rod cap, but just gonna clean off the surface. Like, you can maybe barely feel these scratches with your finger, but still, you'd be surprised what that does to tolerances. So, of course, the bearing has a little notch, and that gets placed exactly in that spot. And so these are OEM spec standard size bearings. They're not bigger or smaller. And so I'm kind of going for everything OEM spec. My goal is kind of like a Subaru type RA block with the RA pistons that we sourced. It's kind of a cool thing, I would presume. So just place that in there. Make sure it's flush, and then of course, when you put both of them, I have my hands have oil on there, so I'm going to quickly, set that in there, and then of course the two notched sides go together, like so. There we go. So you can see the new bearing in there, and then I'm just going to put in the 12 mil rod bolts. And then what I could do is measure this and then measure, the diameter of the rod journal on the crankshaft, but I kind of just want to put it together and see how it fits, right? So kind of actually seems like it fits a little too tight. So you feel that? That's an interesting one. I'll see if they're all like that. We're gonna pull that off. Let's put it on another one. For example, it could just be because the crankshaft is not lubed at all. Should probably lube it up at least a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's gonna feel tight either way, but there's definitely no play. It's actually feels very nice and tight. let me double check these bearings, make sure they're not a what they would call undersized. With the bearings, the terminology is a little bit backwards. You say undersized for a bearing that is thicker, and oversized for a bearing that is thinner. Now they look standard, so I'm just gonna lube this up more and we'll put that back, and then I'll get a second opinion from my dad. For a second test with our rod bearings and rod and seeing how it fits on the brand new crank, I'm gonna use some assembly lube. Just dabbed it on the rod journals here. So again, the rod journals are the ones that have the rods on them. The main journal bearings are the ones that are on the main bearings for the crank, and they're the ones that are in the middle of the block. So assembly lube is good stuff. You put it on everything that is going to be rubbing right when you start the car, because oil pressure will not be able to reach there yet. You just put it pretty much everywhere that you know that there's going to be friction, and before the car builds up oil pressure, or even if you're going to turn over the engine before you start the car, this is very useful stuff. Some people don't really care for assembly lube, they just use thick oil, but I think it's pretty good stuff. So I have it on there. It's a little bit tight. Let me just throw on these 12 mil bolts and start them off, ratchet them on there. And let's see. I mean, honestly, check this out. This is how they tell you to test this. You're supposed to kind of get it over the crest and let it go. And if it falls nice and slowly, that means you have good tight tolerances. If it doesn't fall at all, you're probably too tight. And then if you let it go and it kind of plops on the ground, thunk, you can do another test by kind of like the wiggle test. So left and right, you're supposed to have a tiny bit of wiggle, but up and down, it's supposed to be pretty much not felt. Like, I think this is good. We could even try it a second time on the second one. Technically, this rod comes off of cylinder number 4, which is the furthest back. So it would actually be on this rod journal on the crankshaft. So we'll just put it there. Let's try that. Let's put it on the one that it will actually be on. And something that we'll do later is we're gonna weigh all these rods along with their bearings in them and make sure the weight is good. If there's any of them that are considerably different in weight, we're gonna figure out a way to quote-unquote balance the engine. Balance, I meant try to match them up in the way where they counterbalance each other on the two sides. So cylinder 4 in the car is the rearmost cylinder, which is that one. We're gonna dab assembly lube on there. Come on, this stuff's pretty old, but still nice and thick and tacky. This is another reason when, if you do assembly lube, it's good to do a pretty quick oil change after the first 5-10 minutes of the car being started up, and the initial braking process for your new engine helps clean out any of this assembly lube stuff that might be in there. It's good to do that regardless. Again, remember that your caps, both the caps need to meet where they have the two little pits that hold the bearings in there. So nicely put that in there. It almost fits better once you've cranked a little bit on the bolts. It's almost like it really gets down in its right spot. Okay. Similar thing. It's nice and tight, but there's no biting. There's no bites. Drop it. Slowly goes down. This is really nice OEM spec tolerance. I'm happy that it's not getting stuck. The build continues. All right, we have a couple simple tools here. Micrometer, these bore gauge type tools. What I want to do is on the one rod where I had a previously spun bearing, as you can see, this is our nice new bearing in there. And of course the end caps are screwed down, not super tightly, but they're tightened up. I want to check, and you can see I have some assembly lube in there. That's why it kind of looks shiny slash liquidy. So I want to check that there's no ovaling or oval effect because of the spun bearings previously. I might need to check that both with the bearing in and out. And so we're just going to check the diameter this way and that way. As we saw in the previous video, the tolerance looks to be really good. I know people use some of those little plastic gauges, or plasti gauge I think they're called, where you can squish this little plastic tab. I might order some on Amazon and just experiment with them, because I've never used them before. They're a great gauge, I guess, for more peace of mind around assembly and engine assembly and tolerances. You could do it on the main bearings or main journal bearings, and then of course rod bearings as well. But let's just give it a shot. Let's see what these things measure out to. So micrometer, have it zeroed out. I'm just gonna simply try and measure this journal and record that value. And then also, so that seems to be good and tight. So according to my calculations, it is two full inches, almost 2.1, and 58.5 thousandths. I don't know if I'm reading it correctly, but anyway, we're gonna take measurements, so I'm gonna jot that down. And of course, if we don't adjust anything there, you could even kind of lock it down on the micrometer here with this little locking nut. And so you can measure the inside of the rod with one of these bore gauge tools. So if I loosen it, you can see those pop out, and they have a little spring action to them. I'm gonna oil, got some oil on my hands, gonna oil them a little bit. So usually what you do is tighten it up, put it in. This one's almost already at like that correct bore. And there's a trick to it. You don't just measure straight across and then tighten and take it out, because that will usually not get you the exact measurement. You kind of put it in diagonal, like so, tighten it up a little bit, and then as you remove it, you're going to get a more true measurement, because it's going to adjust with the tightening nut already slightly tightened. And so let me pop this in here. Let's see how we compare to the journal. I mean, it fits in here. So for example, if we were, I'm gonna loosen my, of course, little tightening nut. So if the journal bearing, sorry, if the bearing if the crankshaft is this size, super crudely, we've got about 1.5 thousandths, I'd say. So about 1.5 thousandths of clearance, or a 0.01 inch. And I can measure that again. I'll do both. So I'll go over here, back to the crank. I'm just gonna get that measurement, tighten it up. So again, we are here. You can also do a little experiment. You can loosen the dial and you can move the 0 to there. So that will be your like baseline or 0 point. So boom, super cool, right? And so now we can tighten the dial. I can even remeasure this thing. So let's loosen that, put these back in, tighten it, put it in here, take it out, make sure it's tight. So we could see just a little bit came out. This is almost a perfect size for that. And so it's fitting in here pretty easily. And so if I loosen this bad boy, let me get this right. I mean, it's pretty tight. Let's see. I might even use a smaller bore gauge to get a more true reading. But for example, if that was our 0, yeah, let me get a different bore gauge, the next size down, so those can come out more. We still have our 0 here, so it's not a huge deal if I am off by a little bit in that case. Let me see, the next size down is this guy. Let's see if it's long enough. It is, good. So, boop. Okay. Plop it in there again. Try to plop it in there. Okay, so let's look at this. You see that? On the bottom, I'm measuring about 1, 2, maybe 3 thousandths. Again, these are, I'm really estimating. I'm using some fairly crude tools. Yes, we're still measuring thousandths. But again, I'm trying to compare, you know, the clearance here from the crankshaft to the bearing. And so as long as you're not floosy, like over 2-3 thousandths, I think you'll be okay. I'm sure there's a lot of ways that people do this, and so I'll order some of the plasti gauge just to show it in the video here. I'm pretty interested how those work.